Iran and Israel are now locked in the most dangerous stage of their long-running confrontation. Events of the past weeks have pushed the conflict into a new phase with consequences neither side can fully control. What began as covert operations and proxy battles has escalated into a direct clash with global implications. The pace of escalation has shocked governments across the world and shaken old assumptions about how far Tehran or Tel Aviv are willing to go. For decades, both countries operated through deniable strikes, regional partners, and intelligence networks that kept the struggle contained. That framework has now shattered, and the region is entering uncharted territory. Iran's leadership believed that maintaining pressure through its regional allies would deter Israel from acting directly. Israel, meanwhile, assumed that Iran would avoid open confrontation to preserve the stability of its government and military. Both calculations collapsed almost simultaneously. This shift did not happen overnight, but recent events have accelerated every pressure point in the rivalry. The roots of this escalation stretch back years, shaped by assassinations, sabotage, cyber attacks, and shadow warfare. Yet the latest developments forced both sides into decisions that neither had planned for and neither truly wanted. The current crisis began with a chain of miscalculations and retaliations that expanded far beyond the original triggers. When Iran signaled that it would intensify support for its armed groups across the region, it underestimated the scale of Israel's potential response. Israel, in turn, misjudged Tehran's willingness to absorb strikes on sensitive targets without retaliating. The result was a rapid cycle of action and counteraction that neither country managed to contain. Multiple intelligence agencies now warn that the conflict has entered a stage where even a small incident could ignite a much larger war. Diplomats describe this moment as the closest the region has come to a major military confrontation in decades. The international community is scrambling to prevent total escalation, but both Iran and Israel feel boxed in by domestic pressures. Inside Iran, public anger has risen as images of destroyed infrastructure circulate widely. The government feels compelled to respond forcefully to maintain authority and avoid appearing weak. At the same time, Israeli officials argue that failing to confront Iran now could leave the country vulnerable to far greater dangers later. Both narratives feed into a spiral that is increasingly difficult to stop. Regional actors, from the Gulf states to Turkey and the United States, now weigh how this standoff could reshape the balance of power across the Middle East. Each country is calculating its own risks, alliances, and potential opportunities in the chaos. As these calculations unfold, the region edges closer to a scenario where a single misstep could trigger a broader conflict. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies race to map out Iran's capabilities and Israel's potential next moves. Everyone understands that what happens next could shape Middle Eastern geopolitics for an entire generation. The situation has become so volatile that even traditional diplomatic channels seem insufficient to slow the escalation. Both sides are preparing for possibilities they had hoped to avoid, including direct military confrontation. This is the backdrop to the crisis the world is now witnessing. How it unfolded, why it escalated so fast, and what it means for the future are questions this analysis will explore. Iran's military doctrine has long relied on dispersion, redundancy, and the use of regional partners to extend its reach. For years, this approach created a protective buffer that kept conflicts distant from Iranian territory. But in recent months, that entire system has come under unprecedented strain. Groups that Tehran once considered reliable extensions of its strategic influence have been weakened or overwhelmed. Long-standing supply routes have been disrupted, and arsenals that took decades to build have been depleted or destroyed. These losses undermined Iran's confidence that it could deter Israel without direct involvement. As Israel increased pressure, Iran's leadership found itself facing diminishing options. Retaliation became increasingly likely not because Iran sought a wider conflict, but because failing to respond would expose deeper vulnerabilities. Inside Israel, Policymakers interpreted Iran's hesitation as a sign that their intensified operations were achieving results. This encouraged a more aggressive posture, pushing Israel to strike targets previously considered too risky. Those strikes hit deeper into Iran's military infrastructure and intelligence networks than at any point in the past decade. Each attack forced Tehran to assess whether restraint was still viable or whether it risked looking powerless on the regional stage. Iran's internal debates over retaliation became more intense, involving military commanders, intelligence agencies, and political factions. Hardliners argued that a strong, unmistakable response was the only way to restore deterrence. Others warned that any major retaliation could provoke overwhelming Israeli counterstrikes. These conflicting views delayed decision-making just long enough for Israel to act again, raising the stakes further. By the time Tehran finalized its strategy, events were already moving faster than its leadership anticipated. A carefully calibrated response became nearly impossible as each development narrowed Iran's choices. Pressure from the public also created new political risks for the Iranian government. Images of Israeli strikes circulated quickly, fueling criticism of officials who promised security but appeared unable to prevent escalating attacks. For Iranian leaders, preserving domestic legitimacy became just as important as deterring Israel. The regime could not afford to appear passive, especially after years of declaring itself the leading force of resistance in the region. This combination of external pressure and internal expectation pushed Iran toward a more confrontational stance. Israel, aware of the rising tensions, began preparing for a scenario where Iran might abandon restraint entirely. Military planners updated contingency plans, redeployed assets, and strengthened defensive networks in anticipation of large-scale retaliation. International observers warned that preparations on both sides resembled the early stages of a major interstate conflict. The U.S., Gulf states, and European governments issued repeated calls for de-escalation, but neither Iran nor Israel felt able to step back. Each believed retreat would invite greater threats in the future. The dynamic now unfolding is the result of years of unresolved hostilities meeting a moment of extraordinary geopolitical stress. Every actor in the region understands that the threshold for miscalculation is dangerously low. One wrong decision, one misunderstood signal, or one unexpected strike could unleash consequences far beyond the intentions of either government. As the confrontation deepened, Israel intensified its focus on dismantling Iran's operational networks beyond its borders. This strategy targeted not only military infrastructure, but also the logistical chains that allowed Iran to project power across the region. Precision strikes degraded command sites, storage depots, and transport corridors that Tehran had relied on for decades. Each strike disrupted multiple layers of Iran's regional presence, forcing the country to divert resources toward rebuilding rather than advancing. Iran struggled to recover quickly enough to maintain pressure through its remaining partners. Some allied groups faced severe shortages of equipment and funding, weakening their ability to influence regional dynamics. For the first time in many years, Iran found itself reacting more than directing events. This shift placed enormous strain on Tehran's security establishment. Commanders accustomed to controlling proxy operations now dealt with unexpected gaps in communication, supply, and coordination. Israel's strategy succeeded in exposing how dependent Iran had become on external networks to achieve its objectives. Tehran's inability to rely fully on these partners left it more isolated in the confrontation than at any point in recent memory. Meanwhile, intelligence assessments showed that Iran's internal defenses were not as impenetrable as previously believed. Israel appeared increasingly capable of penetrating secure facilities, compromising communication channels, and striking targets deep inside Iranian territory. These operations signaled that Israel could hit at will, challenging Iran's claims of deterrence. Such breaches created deep concern within Iran's political and military leadership. Officials questioned how far Israel might go if conflict continued to escalate. The possibility that key strategic sites, military, technological, and symbolic, could be targeted raised fears of lasting damage to national stability. Pressure mounted on Iranian leaders to demonstrate that these vulnerabilities did not reflect a permanent shift in the balance of power. This pressure led to calls for actions that would show Iran remained capable of imposing significant costs on Israel. As a result, Tehran's leadership began weighing options that once would have seemed unthinkable due to the risks involved. Israel, observing these signals, prepared for scenarios involving large-scale missile barrages, drone waves, or coordinated attacks by regional groups. Military analysts across the world warned that any such action could trigger devastating retaliation and potentially a broader regional war. Both countries recognized that the window for preventing a spiraling conflict was narrowing quickly. Yet neither side wished to be the first to signal weakness or retreat. This mutual determination to stand firm created a deadlock with enormous danger built into it. Diplomats attempting to mediate described the situation as a collision course set in slow motion. The longer neither side backed down, the greater the probability that an irreversible event would occur. The geopolitical landscape of the Middle East began shifting as states prepared for the possibility of a long, unpredictable conflict. Some countries strengthened alliances, others secured borders, and many increased defense readiness quietly but significantly. Even global powers outside the region monitored developments closely, understanding the ripple effects a major war could produce. Economic markets began reacting to the rising tension, particularly in energy sectors highly sensitive to Middle Eastern instability. Shipping routes, trade links, and foreign investments all showed early signs of stress. The crisis was no longer just a regional confrontation. It was becoming a factor shaping global uncertainty. Against this backdrop, Iran and Israel accelerated their internal deliberations, knowing any miscalculation might have consequences far beyond the battlefield. As tensions escalated, Israel expanded its intelligence operations to map Iran's remaining strategic assets. These assessments focused on identifying weaknesses within Iran's defensive systems, command structures, and critical infrastructure. The aim was to pressure Iran without immediately triggering a full-scale war. However, the scope of these actions convinced Tehran that Israel was preparing for deeper strikes. This perception intensified debates inside Iran about how to respond decisively without inviting catastrophic retaliation. Military officials argued that showing restraint for too long would embolden Israel to take even bolder actions. Others warned that escalating too quickly could provoke a response far beyond Iran's ability to absorb. These competing views created paralysis at the highest levels of decision-making. While leaders deliberated, Israel continued targeting key nodes in Iran's regional networks. These targeted operations disrupted Iran's ability to coordinate with its remaining allies. The strikes also demonstrated that Israel could bypass Iran's security layers with increasing precision. This capability shook Tehran's confidence in its traditional deterrence strategy. Iran's leaders realized that their regional leverage was shrinking faster than expected. Many of Iran's long-standing partners struggled to operate under intense military pressure. Communications became unreliable, supply chains were cut, and local commanders faced growing difficulties maintaining cohesion. As these external networks weakened, Iran began reassessing its broader strategic posture. Officials debated whether relying heavily on proxies had created vulnerabilities that Israel was now exploiting. The shift forced Tehran to consider more direct forms of deterrence. This marked a dangerous turning point in the confrontation. Direct engagement had always been the scenario regional leaders hoped to avoid. Yet the erosion of Iran's indirect influence left the government with fewer alternatives. At the same time, Israel interpreted Iran's internal hesitation as a sign that its strategy was working. This encouraged Israeli leaders to push harder, believing they could degrade Iran's capabilities without triggering immediate escalation. But this assumption underestimated the political pressure growing inside Iran. Civil and military leaders alike felt that continued restraint could undermine the government's credibility. For a regime that had built its identity around resistance, appearing weak was considered a strategic risk. Public sentiment further exacerbated this pressure. Images of damaged facilities and disrupted infrastructure spread rapidly across social media. Calls for a stronger response became increasingly loud and difficult for officials to ignore. This created a volatile mix where political necessity and military strategy began to collide. Iran's leadership faced a narrowing path between inaction and escalation, each carrying immense consequences. Regional governments watched these developments with growing concern. Many feared that if Iran chose a more aggressive posture, the conflict could quickly exceed all expectations. Military analysts warned that the region was entering a phase where even limited strikes could trigger a chain reaction. Despite diplomatic attempts to slow the escalation, both sides continued to prepare for worst-case scenarios. Defense systems were reinforced, intelligence operations intensified, and contingency plans updated. The pace of preparations suggested that leaders on both sides believed a major confrontation was no longer theoretical. This atmosphere of readiness contributed to rising global anxieties about where the conflict might lead. Trade routes, energy markets, and geopolitical alliances all began to adjust to the possibility of prolonged instability. The crisis had now entered a stage where diplomatic pressure alone seemed insufficient to reverse momentum. Each passing day reduced the chance of a peaceful outcome. The possibility of a broader conflict was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. As the crisis intensified, both Iran and Israel began preparing for scenarios that once seemed unlikely. Military planners on each side mapped out potential escalations, trying to anticipate the other's next move. But the complexity of the situation made predicting outcomes increasingly difficult. Both countries possessed capabilities that could inflict significant damage, yet neither could be certain how far the other was willing to go. This uncertainty created a dangerous strategic environment. Iran evaluated the possibility of launching coordinated strikes using missiles, drones, and regional allies. Such a response, Iranian commanders argued, could restore deterrence and re-establish the perception of strength. But others in Tehran warned that such actions risked provoking a devastating Israeli counteroffensive. Israel, aware of these internal divisions, accelerated preparations for rapid response operations. Officials feared that failing to act quickly could leave the country vulnerable to a multi-front assault. Security agencies strengthened defenses around critical infrastructure and population centers. The government also prepared the public for the possibility of expanded conflict. Statements from senior officials emphasized the need for readiness and unity. These announcements fueled speculation that Israel expected a major escalation in the near future. Meanwhile, international actors attempted to intervene diplomatically. Foreign ministers and intelligence chiefs held urgent discussions to de-escalate the standoff. However, neither side appeared willing to make concessions that might signal weakness. Global powers expressed concern that even a limited confrontation could spiral out of control. Energy markets reacted sharply as fears grew that regional shipping routes and oil supplies could be disrupted. Businesses and governments around the world began preparing for potential economic shockwaves. The Middle East, already wary from years of instability, braced for what might come next. Countries in the region increased surveillance of their borders and strengthened security protocols. Some governments quietly engaged in back-channel communications, hoping to serve as mediators if the conflict worsened. But the deeper the tension grew, the less effective these diplomatic efforts became. Iran's leadership faced mounting pressure from political factions demanding a forceful response. Israeli officials, in turn, argued that any show of restraint would embolden their adversaries. This created a situation where both sides viewed escalation as preferable to appearing weak. The strategic calculus shifted from avoiding conflict to controlling the terms of an inevitable confrontation. Intelligence agencies warned that the region was approaching a tipping point. Every additional strike, Every military movement and every public statement added more fuel to an already volatile environment. Observers described the situation as a geopolitical powder keg. Even small missteps could lead to consequences far beyond what any actor intended. By this stage, the crisis was no longer merely a bilateral dispute. It had evolved into a destabilizing force shaping global markets, alliances, and security strategies. The actions of Iran and Israel now held implications for countries far beyond the Middle East. As their rivalry edged closer to direct conflict, the world watched with growing alarm. The question was no longer whether confrontation would occur, but how severe it might become, and how far it would spread. This was the new reality shaping the region's future as both nations prepared for the uncertain road ahead.